Welcome to Plantopia. I'm your host, David Goddori, and I'm a plant pathologist at Cornell University. Any listeners who have never met a real live plant pathologist can be forgiven. We are a very low visibility, but very high impact profession. We protect the world's food supply from disease-causing fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes, all of which want to eat your lunch. This time on Plantopia.
Human beings have only been using antibiotics for a very short period of time, less than a century really, and we have a continuing problem of antibiotic resistance, so that we have to constantly be discovering new antibiotics because our old antibiotics no longer work on their targets. Why isn't that happening with the ants? They've apparently been using these antibiotics to control disease organisms for, it could be as many as 50 or 55 million years.
In this episode, we'll take a break from crisis mode and spend time immersed in a pastoral scene of unparalleled beauty. This is a story about small-scale farmers, and I do mean small.
Ants have perfected agriculture as well. They've gotten really good at it, and you could argue that they're better at it than us. I'd like to think that the more we understand that fungus farming ants give us a model system that's very different from humans, and yet in many ways uncannily similar. So whatever commonalities we can find across the two systems might just give us some clues for ways that we can improve not only human agriculture, but maybe human medicine.
Yes, that's right. We're talking about ants. They've been farming for a lot longer than we have, and they're really good at it. They have a story to tell, and we found just the right person to speak on their behalf.
My name is Ted Schultz, and I'm with the National Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian Institution.
My grandfather was a farmer. He was born in the 1890s, before tractors. Now, a person from 1,000 years earlier could have walked onto his farm, and with minimal instruction, they could have used every bit of technology, as limited as it was, that was available to my grandfather. And now that technology has exploded, and we think of ourselves as the most experienced in this field, but insects have been farming for a lot longer than we have, and we don't even know anything about that.
Yes, that's true. And the time scale differences are fantastically huge. The organisms I spend most of my time studying are fungus farming ants, and they've been around for somewhere between 55 and 65 million years. So they're all descended from an ancestral ant that lived, 60 million years ago, that descended from a hunter-gatherer and then discovered how to grow fungus gardens and how to produce all of its food through agriculture.
So they have a bit of a head start on us.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Ants are farmers. What do they grow?
They grow fungi. So not all ants are farmers. There are 15,000 described species of ants and a whole lot more that haven't yet been discovered and given names. And a very small subset of those are farmers, but the ants that I study, there's 245 species of them, and they grow fungi. They all grow fungus gardens. Most of them live underground, so they have chambers underground, and in those chambers are fungus gardens. They're these sort of white cottony masses. When you first see one, it looks like a big ball of maybe cotton, maybe looks a little bit like a sponge. And the ants have very elaborate behaviors, as you might expect. In order to be fungus farmers, they have to go out every day and find bits of organic debris that haven't already been invaded by other microbes and bring that organic material back in and plant their fungus on that organic material. They have to patrol their gardens and weed out other microbes. They have weeds and crop diseases just like we do. And this is all, as I said, most ants don't do this. So this particular group of ants has evolved this very elaborate set of behaviors specifically associated with being farmers.
Ted, I imagine, like most of us, you have to justify your existence to funding agencies and to your supervisors. So tell me, what's the practical impact of ants as farmers?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because my research is pretty much entirely curiosity driven. I spend most of my time traveling in South America, trying to collect as many fungus farming ants and their fungi as I can, and sequence their DNAs and try to figure out the evolutionary history of the ants, the fungi that they grow, and the symbiotic system. But I do like to think that this basic knowledge, like a lot of basic knowledge, could actually be very useful for humans. Like the ants cultivate bacteria on their bodies that produce antibiotics. They've apparently been using these antibiotics to control disease organisms for, it could be as many as 50 or 55 million years since this fungus farming first began. Human beings have only been using antibiotics for a very short period of time, less than a century, really. And we have a continuing problem of antibiotic resistance, so that we have to constantly be discovering new antibiotics because our old antibiotics no longer work on their targets. Why isn't that happening with the ants? I mean, maybe it is. Fortunately, there are some people now studying this question to find out how ants have been effectively using, the same kind of group of antibiotics successfully for 55 million years. And the worlds of medicine and agriculture kind of blur in this fungus farming ant system. I mean, you could also apply that same reasoning to pesticides, and you could ask the same questions like, how can we be more efficient at, growing monocultures of things, because the ants are mainly growing monocultures, without sort of constantly having to come up with new pesticides. So I also work to some degree with anthropologists and archaeologists on comparing fungus farming ants to the evolution of agriculture in ants to the evolution of agriculture in humans, trying to look for kind of broad patterns, because if you think about it, human agriculture is really a symbiosis, just as fungus farming ant agriculture is. So I'd like to think that the more we understand that fungus farming ants give us a model system that's very different from humans, and yet in many ways uncannily similar. So whatever commonalities we can find across the two systems might just give us some clues for ways that we can improve not only human agriculture, but maybe human medicine.
Well, Ted Schultz, I thought I had one of the most interesting jobs in the world, but I can see that yours is pretty close.
Yeah.
So how do ants as farmers handle competition from pathogens, from other insects, and from weeds?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when I first got into this stuff, we knew nothing. We knew that it appeared that the ants, I should say that the most famous of these ants are leafcutter ants, and most people have heard of leafcutter ants. If they've ever traveled in South America, Central America, they've seen leafcutter ants. If they've ever watched nature documentaries, they've probably seen them. And leafcutter ants, as well as their sort of more inconspicuous, primitive fungus farming cousins, they all process the material they bring into the nest to some degree. So it's been known for some time that they lick it, and they seem to be applying salivary secretions or something to the material. So they're definitely preparing the material, maybe suppressing some microorganisms when they first introduce the material to the garden. They're also giving their fungus a really good starting chance on that material by going and finding healthy growing fungal mycelium from the healthiest parts of the garden, picking that, bringing it back, planting it on that newly added organic substrate, and then constantly patrolling and weeding. So they're mechanically weeding out they're detecting unwanted microbes. So they have the ability through smell and taste to detect things that are not the garden fungus that should be there, and to mechanically weed those out with their mandibles. Ants are actually pretty dexterous with their mandibles, and to throw that stuff out. But something we've learned since I started doing this stuff that's pretty wonderful is that most of these fungus farming ants have bacteria growing on their bodies, and these bacteria are often housed in specialized crypts in their integuments on their bodies, and those crypts are fed with glands that apparently are nourishing these bacteria, and these bacteria are in the actinomycetes. That this is a group of filamentous bacteria that also includes streptomyces. So it's a group from which humans get a whole lot of antibiotics, and the ants are also using these bacteria for antibiotics, and they're applying those antibiotics to their gardens and controlling the growth of microbes using those antibiotics. And the more we look at these gardens, the more complicated things get. So the main part of the garden is definitely the resident single fungal species that the ants are growing, but there's also a bunch of other microbes in there, and there's another fungus that regularly occurs in there. There's multiple species of this fungus. It's only known from the gardens of fungus farming ants, and it is a weed of the system. It competes with the ants to eat the fungus, just like our weeds compete with us to eat our crop plants. And the ants are using these antibiotics to control that weed organism. And it looks like over this 50 million years or so of evolution between the ants and the fungi that they cultivate, this weed has also been involved. It's called Escovopsis. It's an ascomycete fungus. It's apparently been involved since very early times. So it's sort of diversified along with the ants and the fungi, and now there's many species of Escovopsis. And they appear to be kind of, given Escovopsis species seems to be specialized on a given fungal cultivar species, or at least a small group of fungal cultivars.
Plantopia is brought to you by the American Phytopathological Society, or APS, to honor the United Nations celebration of 2020 as the International Year of Plant Health. Healthy plants can help us solve world hunger, stabilize the world's climate, protect our forests, and add beauty to our lives. Now, back to the show. So the ants can not only farm, but they can apply crop protection chemicals, and it would appear that they can don some kind of protective gear by carrying these things about on their body.
Yeah,
they're quite good at this.
They've had a lot of time to perfect this, and I actually work with people who specialize in human agriculture and the evolution of human agriculture. And so I think a fair amount about comparisons. And humans have the advantage of having cultural transmission. So as a generation learns, say, how to perfect or to get better at farming, it can pass that knowledge along to the next generation. And so we can very rapidly, in the course of, say, 5 to 10,000 years, we've taken what was at one point fairly primitive agriculture, and we have the agriculture that we have today. And that's because we can plan, we can experiment, and we can pass what we learn along to the next generation through cultural transmission. Ants learn as well. Ants have perfected agriculture as well. They've gotten really good at it, and you could argue that they're better at it than us. But the way that they learn is much slower because it's evolutionary learning, it's genetic learning, it's through the trial and error of natural selection. So in any given generation, if ants inherit some behavior that makes them do agriculture a little bit differently, and if that turns out to be advantageous, eventually that gene's going to spread, and over evolutionary time periods, they're going to get better and better and better, and that's what's happened. But it just takes longer. So what took humans 10,000 years, it took ants 55 million years.
Is there an intersection of ant farmers and human farming? Are there examples of mutual benefits between the two systems?
Well, yes. But before I talk about that, I will first talk about the detriments, because if you want to talk about leafcutter ants, which are the most famous and well-known of fungus farming ants, they're actually the major pests of human agriculture in the New World tropics. So for most human farmers in the New World tropics, fungus farming ants are like their enemies, which I think is really unfortunate, because only a few fungus farming ant species, even just a few leaf cutting ant species, are really harmful to human crops. And an interesting thing about that is that the local native plants in the New World tropics have actually co-evolved along with leaf-cutting ants, so that they are much less hard hit by leaf-cutting ants than most of the exotic crops that human farmers are trying to grow. So local native plants have evolved ways of expressing toxins only when they sense that they're being cut by leaf-cutter ants. They also have a fair number of mechanical things that interfere with leaf-cutter ant cutting. So, in fact, leaf-cutter ants, for the most part, will not forage on a given native plant, especially if it's a large plant like a tree or something, long enough to kill it, because at some point the tree is going to repel them and they're going to move on to some other thing. So they're really kind of more like husbanding the vegetation in the vicinity of the nest rather than decimating it. But they don't treat non-native vegetation, orange groves and things like that, have not evolved defenses like that. And so they are very vulnerable to leafcutter ant foraging. But that's the way in which fungus farming ants are actually opposed to human agriculture. I think if you were to look across the landscape at all the species of fungus farming ants, you would find that most of them are neutral. They're possibly not benefiting human agriculture, but they're certainly not harming it. Most of these ants have very small nests. They might have a colony size of 50 worker ants when it's a mature colony. In some cases, hundreds or a few thousands, but not like leafcutters with millions of workers in a nest. And many of these ants are very beneficial. They're going out there. They're foraging for organic substrates, insect frass. So insect poop is a big one for them. Also, little tiny flower parts that rain down from the canopy, stuff like that. And they're carrying all that back into their nest, taking it deep underground, growing fungi on that organic substrate. They're major turners of the soil, and they're major fertilizer. They're taking nitrogen down into nitrogen poor soils, and much of it stays down there. So that's a way in which they intersect.
So it's a bit like microorganisms. There are more good ones than bad ones, but the bad ones get all the publicity.
Yeah, that's the truth. And I mean, that's the truth for insects in general. I mean, the vast majority of the millions of species of insects are beneficial to humans. I mean, if you removed all the insects, we'd probably all be dead. And in my microcosm, the world of ants, it's again true. I don't know, maybe a lot of people, when they think of ants, they think of fire ants or something. And if you're in South America, they think of leafcutter ants. But those are just the small minority. And the great majority are, critical key components of ecosystems.
So you've mentioned ants that can farm fungi. Can you tell us anything about ants that can actually run a dairy?
Yes, this is another example of what I would say is very striking parallels between humans and ants. And I would go so far as to say fungus farming ants and the tending of honeydew-producing homopterans in other groups of ants are actually examples of convergent agriculture. Ants, there are many species of ants that tend above ground, mostly aphids, but a few other plant-sucking insects. These plant-sucking insects are feeding on plant sap. In order to get plant sap is very, very nutrient poor. In order to get and filter through enough of it to get the nutrients, they have to secrete tons of it. They're basically like sucking juice from the plant in one end and pumping it out the other. And that the part that they're pumping out is colloquially known as honeydew, and a lot of ants harvest that honeydew, and sometimes the honeydew is modified somewhat to be attractive to ants. It's rich in carbohydrate, and the ants protect their homopteran herds, so they protect them from predators and parasites that would otherwise prey on them, because they're very stationary. They're just stuck on the surface of a plant with their long beak-like proboscis buried deep in the plant, sucking up the plant sap. They can't really run away or move very easily, but they have evolved to make something that ants like, so that ants will stick around and protect them. And in many cases, the honeydew-producing insects need the ants more than the ants need them. So there's many species of ants that, they will feed on honeydew, but if there's none around, they're able to get food elsewhere. But some ants have evolved to be obligate cattle raisers. And these are pretty remarkable. For instance, there's these underground ants in a genus called Acropyga that cultivate what's essentially a subterranean homopteran that feeds on roots and gets the plant sap out of the roots. And when these ants send out daughter queens to mate and found new colonies, each of those daughter queens carries in her mandibles one of those little homopterans. And that is going to be sort of the clonal beginning starter parent of her herd, her underground herd. And there's these ants in Southeast Asia that tend these big giant herds of another kind of homopteran, and they move them around. When the plant gets depleted, they move them all to a new plant, and they bring them in every night into the shelters that they provide to protect them at night. So very, very uncannily analogous to humans and our cattle herds.
In so many ways, the aphid, the ant bride has a dowry of
yes.
of one aphid cow.
Yes. And I should point out that in the fungus farming ants, there's a very similar phenomenon. When a daughter queen is ready to fly away from her mother's nest to found her own colony, to mate, and then found her own colony, dig a hole in the ground, and start her, lay eggs and grow up baby ants and start her garden, she takes a little bit of her mother's garden with her in a special pouch in her mouth. And when she mates and starts that colony, she spits that out and takes care of that garden until her first little brood of baby ants, larvae, grow up into adult worker ants, and then they take over that job.
So, do these ants all grow the same fungus? Are they sharing a seed bank of some kind?
That's a very interesting question. And in fact, the answer is no. We don't know what the earliest fungus farming ant grew. It's very likely that maybe it could grow a few different kinds of fungi, and maybe if there weren't any fungi around, it could just go and hunt and eat some insect meat or do something like that, like a lot of ants do now. But at some point, we think very early on, it got locked into a particular kind of fungus. And we know we kind of have a pretty good idea of what that fungus is, because what we've been doing now is we've been collecting lots of fungus farming ant colonies, culturing the fungi, sequencing the DNA of the fungi, and also comparing it to a lot of the DNA of a lot of free-living fungi that are in that same kind of closely related group of fungi. And so we kind of have a pretty good idea what these ants were originally growing. But in a few cases now, we know that, at least in one case, a group of ants has jumped to a completely different fungus. It was very, very exciting and unexpected when we first discovered this. It's in the same order of fungi, the Agaricales, but it's in a completely different family. We'd love to know how that happened. We think it happened around 20 million years ago. None of those ants are able to grow the original fungi anymore. They're all growing those new fungi. And then from within the original group of fungi, there's been a few strange things that have evolved out of it. So there's one group of ants that just cultivates these fungi that grow, when they're growing with ants, they grow in a unicellular form that we call yeast gardens. They look very different from all the other ants' gardens. And then most notably, there's one group of these original fungi evolved into what we call the higher attine fungi. And all those original fungi seem to be able to live without ants. It seems like, that if they're in an ant nest, they grow fine and they do well and everybody's happy, including the ants. But they can also kind of escape from the symbiosis, live out in nature like a regular fungus growing in the leaf litter and making mushrooms. Well, The higher attine fungi are no longer able to do that. They have become what we call domesticated, just like some of our crops. They're no longer able to live without their farmers. They are totally dependent on their farmers to be propagated. They've become polyploid, like many of our crops. They've become genetic polyploids, and they've changed in many other ways. So over the course of 55 million years, the fungi that these ants grow have kind of changed and diversified and become, in one case, domesticated.
For more information about the International Year of Plant Health, visit us at plantopiapodcast.org. Thanks for listening. Our show is produced by John Bryce. Thanks also to Mark Gleason, Jim Bradeen, Laura Isles, and Roshni Karati. I'm your host, David Gadori, and you've been listening to Plantopia.